Tonight I want to share a story with you. It's called Runaway, and although it's written as a work of fiction, it's based on something that actually happened to me when I was 17, a pivotal experience that began as a kind of unraveling for me, which ultimately led me down a dark road of depression, addiction, and a long line of failed relationships. On the surface, it's a story about a kid who runs away from home in the middle of the winter. But underneath that, it's really a story about shadow work, the kind that happens when the people who are supposed to see you, protect you, and understand you don't. It's about what happens when a young person tries to do something loving, something generous, and instead of being met with gratitude, they're met with judgment and rejection. And how, in that moment, a shadow gets born. As I walk through that night, the cold, the hunger, the fear, the memories that kept me moving, you'll hear how easy it is to mistake attention for love, how easy it is to hand your inner authority over to someone who feels like a lifeline. That's the shadow at play in this story, the wound that leads the wounded to accept the scraps, to say, I'll take whatever warmth I can get. So if you've been following the Shadow Work series, think of this episode as a lived example, just one long night where the shadow took the lead, and where something deeper, quieter, and more honest started to emerge. Runaway is a retelling of a lived experience written by Damien Sabuhian and Andrea Stone, edited by Andrea Stone, with narration generated using OpenArt AI. Please enjoy.
In the end, he'd been undone by a cobweb. How a gossamer wisp of broken-down arachnid architecture could begin such a brutal chain of reactions was just one more philosophical mystery in Rafi's life, which he worked to unravel as he jogged down the side of the road. He had begun the day full of goodwill, altruism even, and now here he was, cold, hungry, and alone, with no place to go. No good deed goes unpunished, he thought wryly, as the bitter January wind crept beneath the collar of his jacket, turning the drying sweat on his back into an ice bath. He had expected to be bathing in the amazement and gratitude of his mother, not heading into darkness with only a leather jacket and jeans to warm his body, and a cold, sorrow-filled lump in his gut. When he'd wakened that morning with the idea to surprise his parents with an unexpectedly clean house, Rafi had imagined the smile it would bring to their faces, especially his mum's, since she was the one who normally kept the house clean. They would be relieved to discover that not only had the house avoided destruction in their absence, but was now cleaner and tidier than when they'd left for Ohio a few days before. Rafi's grandfather, his mum's dad, was dying, and so his mother, distressed by the fact that her father had very little time left in this world, would hug Rafi and thank him for thinking of her, for making her burden a bit less. There would perhaps be tears in her eyes when she realized that, despite the likely loss of her dad, she at least had a son who loved her so much that he would choose to do something like clean an entire house, which he was pretty sure most other 17-year-old sons would never do, unless forced. What he would never have imagined was that such a plan could be so easily derailed. Stupid cobweb. Though there were certain chores expected to be done by Rafi and his two younger brothers, this was the first time that he had taken on the cleaning of the entire house, and of his own volition. And, unlike with his weekly chores, he had taken his time in accomplishing the tasks before him, diligently ensuring that they were done well and without the cutting of proverbial corners. He had even cleaned and organized the pantry, gathering together old grocery bags, picking up the ubiquitous bits of dried onion peel, and matching old Tupperware containers to their lids. He'd worked methodically, almost reverently, as though the house were a body he was trying to heal. The lemony sting of cleanser clung to his hands no matter how many times he rinsed them. His knees ached from scrubbing baseboards no one ever looked at, and his fingers were raw from digging grime out of corners no one would remember noticing. He liked that kind of work, the invisible kind, the kind that left no trace of you behind. The sense of satisfaction he'd felt afterward had been nearly euphoric. He had just dumped out the dirty water and put the bucket back under the sink when he heard his parents' car pull into the driveway. He had glanced around the kitchen, quickly grabbing an errant twist tie and shoving it in the junk drawer, and was leaning oh so casually against the sink when his mom and dad opened the back door and entered the room. Rafi was itching to tell them what he'd just accomplished, but the world-weary sigh heaved by his mother as she came into the house checked the impulse, and he decided to wait until they'd settled in a bit. His usually cheerful, upbeat mom looked careworn, her face drawn with worry. His father looked stern, bordering on angry, but then he pretty much always looked that way. They greeted Rafi and, as his father carried the suitcases into the house and up the stairs, Rafi went to his mom and hugged her. "How's Grandpa doing?" he asked tentatively, fearing the answer. "Terrible," she sighed. "Not good at all. I don't know if he'll make it through the night. I really wanted to stay, but your dad had to get back to prep for his classes, but I put in a leave of absence with the hotline, so I'll probably go back on my own, tomorrow or the next day." Rafi's mom volunteered a few nights a week for the rape crisis hotline and was extremely dedicated to her work. If she had taken time off, then things with her dad must really be bad. "I'm sorry, Mum. That sucks." "Yep, it does suck," she said as she went to the cupboard, took down a glass and filled it with water from the tap. "Well, the good news is you don't have to worry about cleaning the house," Rafi said, unable to hold the surprise any longer. His mum set the glass in the sink and turned to look at him, a bemused expression on her face. "You don't have to worry about cleaning it because I already did it for you," he exclaimed, notes of pride tinging his words. The bemused look turned to surprise. Just as he'd pictured, Rafi noted, pleased with himself. "You did? When did you do that?" "Today, this morning, I cleaned everything, even the pantry, which I also organized. Because you always have to do that stuff, and I wanted, to give you a break or something, because of your dad and everything." Rafi trailed off. He hadn't thought ahead of time what it was he would say, or how he would word it when pronouncing the housework done. And in that moment, he felt he could have expressed it better. Still, the important thing was that he'd done it so she wouldn't have to, and he hoped she'd see that what he'd done was like giving her a gift. "Oh, thanks, honey. That was sweet," she said vaguely, then turned away and headed toward the door, leading to the dining room and the rest of the house. This lukewarm expression of gratitude was not at all what Rafi had expected, and so he followed her, listing the various tasks he'd accomplished and feeling sort of dirty to be so blatantly describing said accomplishments. At the doorway leading to the living room, his mom stopped walking so suddenly that Rafi nearly plowed into her. She was looking up at the ceiling, in the corner where the two walls intersected, and he followed her gaze. At first, he didn't see it, so subtle was its evil, but then, cobweb, big cobweb, floating and dancing in its corner. It hovered there, trembling slightly in the current from the heating vent, a loose, translucent thing, more suggestion than substance. It looked fragile enough to dissolve if you breathed on it too hard. "I thought you said you cleaned the house," his mother said. The words landed with the weight of an accusation that had been waiting years to be spoken. "I did. I cleaned everything, is what you said, but obviously you didn't clean everything because I'm looking at a huge cobweb." He was not imagining the disdain in her voice. "Okay, I guess I missed a spot," Rafi said, shrugging, still thinking this was a minor kink in the situation that would no doubt unkink itself momentarily. Just then, Rafi's father came back downstairs, and, seeing them standing in the corner, with his wife jabbing her finger up at the ceiling, and his son appearing stunned, he approached them, concern wrinkling his brow. "What's going on in here?" he asked, his gaze too, rising to the ceiling. What's going on is that your son thinks doing a slap and dash on the house is the same as cleaning it. Rafi and his father both said, "What?" at the same time, his father's, one of confusion, while Rafi's dripped incredulity. "Mom, I swear I cleaned the house. I just missed one stupid little cobweb. God, I thought you'd be grateful that I did it so you wouldn't have to." "Little cobweb," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "That thing is huge, so if you miss that, I shudder to think what your definition of clean actually is. I think you did a half job and you hoped I wouldn't notice." Rafi stared at it again, suddenly unsure of his own eyesight. It was as if the web had grown while he wasn't looking, swelling to fill the space between them. Rafi's father seemed to be gathering evidence, biding his time before deciding which side of the argument to land on, though Rafi knew that the only side his dad would ever choose was his mom's. "I can't believe you're getting so upset over this, Mom. It's not that big a deal," Rafi said, almost pleading. The words had barely left his mouth when she turned to face him squarely, and, poking a finger into his chest, her voice more growl than anything else, said, "It is a big deal, Rafi, because you tried to get away with doing a minimal amount of work, and now you want me to praise you? Unbelievable." She turned around and walked out of the room. Rafi looked at his dad, hoping for, even needing, some sort of explanation or reassurance. His father stood, his arms folded, and looked at him, head slightly cocked to the side, as though in an effort to understand this creature before him. "So, is that what you did? Pretended you'd done everything you were supposed to, thinking she wouldn't notice that you actually hadn't?" He gave Rafi the look he usually reserved for those moments when he summoned his sons into his office in order to get to the bottom of the reasons behind whatever aberrant behavior they'd displayed. "No, I actually cleaned the house because I thought it would be a nice thing to do for Mum, and instead I'm getting reamed for it. I'm out of here," Rafi declared, heading back into the kitchen to retrieve his jacket and the keys to the Volkswagen Rabbit that was generally his to drive. His mother came back into the room, saw Rafi grabbing the car keys and said loudly, "You are not taking the car." "Fine. Whatever," he replied, chucking the keys in an underhand toss toward where she stood. Rafi did not wait to see whether she caught or missed them. Instead, he shoved his arms into his jacket and stormed out the back door. He could feel anger coursing through him, heating the blood that was pounding in his ears. He had nearly reached the end of the driveway when he heard his father call out to him, "Rafi, Rafi, stop right there." A small flicker of hope lit within him at the sound of his dad's voice and the potential solace that he would bring. Even Dad knows Mom's being completely crazy right now, he thought as he stood on the black asphalt of the driveway and waited for his approaching father. He's going to tell me to come back inside and wait for her to cool off. But the hope flickered out and fear blazed instead when he saw the look on his father's face. A warning, like gathering black clouds before the rain burst. Rafi had just opened his mouth to say he didn't know what, but something, anything to stem the burgeoning storm, when his eye caught a flicker of movement, his father's arm. And then he felt his brain bounce off his skull when his dad's hand caught him squarely across the cheek and jaw. Outrage blossomed with the pain, and Rafi pointed a finger at his father and said with clenched teeth, "Don't you ever—" Just as the second slap landed, the sound of skin meeting skin resounding up the driveway. His glasses skidded across the driveway, one lens spinning uselessly before settling face down on the asphalt. The world tilted, blurred, his father's face splitting into two indistinct shapes, neither of them familiar. What stunned him most wasn't the pain, it was the precision, the certainty with which his father had decided that this was what the moment required. Hot tears welled up, as much from the sting of humiliation as from the physical pain the slaps induced. Before his father could have a chance to see that he was crying, Rafi turned from him and ran down the street and away, silence behind him until the back door slammed with an aching finality. At the end of the block, Rafi slowed to a walk. He wiped away the remnants of the tears from his cheeks, but the hurt he felt inside remained. He could hardly grasp what had just happened, how pleasure and pride could be so quickly replaced by sadness and dismay. Not to mention the burning rage building within him at being so unjustly treated. If they think I'm coming back tonight, they're crazy, he thought to himself as he continued down the street. A chill wind made him increase his pace, and he noticed a large piece of what looked like white paper scudding down the sidewalk. As he neared it, he saw that it was part of the New Year's banner that had been strung across the street and then apparently torn apart in the storm a few nights ago. Now, all that could be seen of it was this scrap stating, RS 1987. All in all, it didn't seem the best omen for the new year. He kicked it aside as he walked and tried to think of where he should go. He considered, then discarded, the idea of going to one of his friends' houses. No doubt that would occur to his parents as well. And if they were able to verify his whereabouts, then they would be allowed the luxury of not having to worry about where their son had gone. Frankly, Rafi didn't feel that they were entitled to any such relief, while they'd made him feel so incredibly lousy. So, what then? And then it hit him. Maureen, I'll go to Maureen's. His parents would never think to check for Rafi at her house, since they didn't know she existed. Well, they might know she existed. As teachers, they seemed to know everyone in the area. But they certainly had no clue that she was the love of his life. He would go to her, deciding not to let the fact that she lived nearly 30 miles away, and he was on foot with no winter coat and no money, be a deterrent. Just thinking about her made the dead weight in his chest seem lighter. She would not only listen to him, but she would understand. Unlike his parents, who obviously didn't care what he was feeling as long as he did whatever they told him to, got good grades, and, God forbid, didn't call the house clean unless every filament of cobweb had been removed from the property. He felt a new wave of anger wash over him as he turned left toward downtown and the highway that would take him to the town of Eden and Maureen. He hadn't seen or even talked to her since the first day of winter break, as she'd gone to Florida with her family for the holidays. But school started in 2 days, so he assumed, with a good dose of hope, that she would be back home by now. Of course, her family didn't know about Rafi either, which meant he might have some difficulty finding a way to talk to her. But the moment that the thought of seeing her had entered his mind, it had become paramount. He must see her, whatever the difficulties or consequences. Besides, he had several miles in which to come up with some sort of plan. Just thinking about Maureen made his chest loosen, like loosening a belt one notch after a long day. She had a way of making the world seem arranged around him, as though the chaos had an order he simply hadn't been taught yet. He continued down the highway, alternately walking and trotting, the winter sun sinking ever lower into the horizon behind him. And as the shadows lengthened, the cold seemed to become more substantive, and his t-shirt and leather jacket were not up to the task of keeping it out. His anger had kept him warm at first, but now that anger was fading to sorrow, which apparently lacked any warming aspect. He also realized he was hungry and thirsty, and there was nothing but houses for several miles. He'd have to wait until he reached Silver Creek before he found a store. Then he remembered that he had no money. Well, there was nothing for it. He couldn't possibly make it all the way to Maureen's on an empty stomach, and so he would do what he had to do, shoplift. He'd never stolen anything before, but he knew from those friends of his who did that it wasn't that hard. Desperate times, he thought, and, anyway, this was his parents' doing. They were driving him to head out alone into the approaching night and steal in order to eat. Oddly, this thought pleased him in some way, but Silver Creek was several miles away, and so, in order to distract himself from the gnawing in his stomach, he imagined what he would tell Maureen once he got there. He often created such dialogues in his mind, finding the best words to describe something that had happened or how he was feeling. In fact, before he'd started seeing Maureen, back when he only knew her from class, he'd had many such conversations with her. He had somehow known that she was a person he'd be able to talk to, openly and honestly, without the trepidation that often accompanied his real-world conversations. Thinking about it, he also realized how much more confident in himself he'd become since knowing her, and how much less alone he felt in general. Of course, his parents would never understand that either. They would have already decided to disapprove of the relationship, he was certain, before ever giving her a chance. My parents only care about me to the extent that I represent them, and if I want to do something or be with someone that doesn't fit their definition of proper, they lose. Same thing with my grades. If I don't do well, then they freak out that I won't get into college, and therefore my life will be ruined. But really, it's that they'll be embarrassed to have such a loser son. He thought about the time last year when he'd changed 3 Fs on his report card to Bs, and how they'd discovered what he'd done at the parent-teacher conference. Admittedly, that had been embarrassing. But what did they expect? They'd put so much pressure on him to do well that he'd been terrified to bring home Fs, and so had changed them to prevent his mother from having to leave town in shame, and his father from having a stroke. When the truth had come out, it had led to a very uncomfortable, tear and anger-filled afternoon at the Tanzarian house. And when he'd admitted that he hated school, hated himself actually, and that he was suffering bouts of depression, did his father speak soothing words while his mom hugged and comforted him? No. Instead, they'd set about solving the problem by sending him to a shrink whose agenda was clearly aimed at turning Rafi into a school-loving, happy, contributing member of society. Their society, of course. So, while they paid the therapist to accomplish, in Rafi's opinion, absolutely nothing, it was Maureen that had turned his life into something livable. And now, he not only liked school, he adored it. Of course, that was mostly because he got to see Maureen, but he was also starting to make an effort with his schoolwork, was beginning to actually care about and get good grades, and to plan for his future. And that, too, was because of Maureen. He wanted to make her proud, to impress her even. Furthermore, she made him feel as though he had something to offer the world, and that he was special, unique, and worthy of being loved. She had given him a feeling of confidence he'd never experienced. Lost in his thoughts, Rafi realized he'd made good time and was just about to come into Silver Creek. As he rounded the last bend in the road, he saw some sort of grocery store or mini-mart up ahead. He jogged the last stretch and entered the parking lot of what he now saw was a convenience store. He could tell what it was because the sign above it proclaimed, "Convenient," though the light had gone out in the second E. He stepped through the doors, the heat inside enveloping him and causing shivers to rack his body, momentarily making him feel colder than he had outside. There was a clerk at the register and a couple of customers, but it didn't appear that there was anyone else working. He tried not to imagine someone coming back from break just as he stuffed whatever into his jacket. Rafi's heart was pounding as he walked to the back of the small store, and he regretted jogging the last 100 yards, increasing his heart rate so that, combined with nervous adrenaline, made him feel like he was about to have a heart attack. He turned down an aisle where he saw a long rack of candy bars. Fine, that would do. He was so hungry, and every one of those bars sounded amazing. But in the end, he chose a king-sized Kit Kat because it was the biggest of the options, and he wanted to get as much bang for his non-buck as possible. Plus, it was nice and flat, and thus easily concealed, he hoped. He glanced around him, trying not to be obvious as he did so, and, seeing the coast was clear, tucked the candy into the inside pocket of his jacket. He then cruised up and down a couple more aisles, as though looking for something in particular, and then headed toward the front door, attempting a look of frustrated disappointment for the benefit of anyone looking. He had just made it to the counter and was about to pass it by and to head out the door when, "Hey, what are you doing?" Rafi stopped and slowly turned around, despite the fact that everything inside of him was screaming at him to bolt. Behind him, a young man was strolling toward the counter and smiling. Rafi heard the cashier say, "Oh, just working." In the same moment that he realized the man's smile was aimed beyond Rafi and at the cashier, so he took this as his cue to get the hell out of there. He pushed on the door just to have it refuse to open. Realizing his mistake, he fumbled with the long metal handle stretched across the width of the glass door and pulled on it instead. The door opened, and Rafi fairly stumbled into the night and then fast walked across the parking lot. He felt like he had the flu, skin clammy, his heart pounding, and a wave of nausea ramping up in his gut. He was shaking and didn't know whether he wanted to laugh or cry. Fearful that someone from the store might be watching, Rafi kept walking until he'd gone down the road a bit and had come to one of the several vista points between the highway and Lake Erie. There was a rutted gravel parking lot, pocked with potholes, which threatened to twist an ankle in the darkness that had come into full fruition while he'd been inside convenient. There was a half circle of vacant benches facing the lake, and Rafi made his way to the one in the middle, sat down, and removed the Kit Kat from his jacket. His gut knew he was holding, and it sent forth a high-pitched whine of desperation. He noted that his mouth was watering at the thought of food, and then he berated himself for choosing candy over something more nutritious. He tore open the wrapper and snapped off a bar, or would you call it a stick, or maybe a cat, bit off half and then shoved the other half in as well. He had barely tasted it before it was already in his stomach, and he then proceeded to eat half of the packaged chocolatey goodness, demolishing each kit or cat in rapid succession. The sugar surged through his bloodstream, making him giddy, almost dizzy. Now he chided himself for not getting something to drink, although the sound of sloshing liquid coming from inside his jacket might have been a giveaway that he was not exactly on the up and up. He sat on the bench, allowing his stomach to process the sudden influx of calories, and trying to pep himself up for the rest of the walk to Eden. He comforted himself with the knowledge that he was already more than halfway there. It was inky dark, the overcast sky preventing the moon from casting much light. He realized that the temperature had dropped even farther, and he had begun to shiver, especially as his traumatic experience at Convenient had caused him to sweat so profusely that his t-shirt was once again damp. So, to warm himself as well as to make the miles pass more quickly, Rafi continued down the highway at a jog. There wasn't much of a shoulder to the road, but fortunately, there was little traffic. As he ran, so did his thoughts, and in the same direction that his legs were taking him, toward Maureen. He hoped he would remember how to get to her house once he reached Eden, as he'd only been there once before. However, that one visit would forever be etched into his brain. Of that, he had no doubt. It had been a rainy Saturday in the fall of the previous year. Maureen and Rafi had been going out for several months, though they had yet to go anywhere other than her car. Most days after school, Maureen would drive Rafi home, and once she'd pulled up to the curb outside his house, they would sit in the car and continue to talk, sometimes for an hour or two. They discussed poetry and literature, music and film, psychology and philosophy, religion and sex. But more importantly, to Rafi at least, they talked about their lives, their feelings, their hopes and dreams, with an honesty he didn't know was possible outside the pages of a book or the confines of the silver screen. These conversations fulfilled a fantasy long held by Rafi, to have a person in his life with whom he could share his most personal thoughts and emotions, and without fear of judgment. What would be too embarrassing to admit to anyone else, including himself, he shared with Maureen, and she with him. It was like they each played the role of the other's therapist, and the prescription they used to mitigate their respective troubles, a daily dose of love and passion. The fact that Maureen had fallen for Rafi when she could have just about anyone, that she had chosen him, filled him with a buoyant confidence that had seeped into every aspect of his life. Of course, The downside was that, because they knew that neither Rafi's nor Maureen's family would approve of or understand the depth of their relationship, they had to keep anything beyond friendship completely secret. At times, this frustrated Rafi because he wanted to announce their relationship to everyone. Yet, at the same time, this secret knowledge created within him a sense of pride and made him feel worldly and mature, especially compared to his classmates. For the first few months, really all they'd done, besides talk, was make out a little in an empty classroom after school, or in her car, which they'd park in some out-of-the-way location. But of course, that afternoon at her house had taken things to a whole other level, changing their relationship, and Rafi's life as well. As he ran down the highway, he allowed himself, as he so often did, to relive that day. He reveled in the thrilling details which, no matter how often he replayed them in his head, never failed to fill him with a warm happiness, the likes of which he'd never experienced before, and felt certain could never be topped by any other event in his life. Maureen's family had been out of town for the weekend, and she had invited Rafi to spend that Saturday with her at her home. He still felt the excitement he'd felt then, finally being able to see where she lived, to be in her bedroom, surrounded by all of the personal objects that spoke of who she was and what was important to her. He had been extremely nervous as well, knowing as he did that they were going to have sex. And though Maureen was experienced in this arena, Rafi had been a virgin. They had sat, then lain, on her bed in their clothes, kissing and touching, and enjoying the fact that they could relax and take their time. And then she'd gotten up and, turning to look at him with passion in her eyes, had whispered that he should take off his clothes while she put on some music. Then she'd left the room, headed downstairs to turn on the stereo, which was connected to speakers throughout the house. Rafi was so nervous and excited by then that he was shaking as he pulled off his t-shirt, and he had a difficult time getting the button of his jeans undone. Eventually, he had managed to undress himself completely, but had no idea what to do next. Should he get under the covers and wait for her there? Sit on the bed? He felt awkward standing there naked, but at the same time, he didn't want to appear shy or ashamed by hiding himself beneath the blankets. And so, he decided to just simply stand next to the bed and await her arrival. He heard the beginning chords of Peter Gabriel's In Your Eyes, and tears came to his own as he thought how amazing Maureen was to pick such a perfect song for this moment. When she reappeared in the doorway to the bedroom, still dressed, he began to regret his decision not to get into the bed, but Maureen seemed not to think anything of it, as she let her eyes explore his body with obvious longing. Maureen moved with an ease that made Rafi feel both thrilled and oddly relieved, as though she were carrying the weight of knowing what came next so that he didn't have to. When she looked at him, it felt like being selected from a crowd he hadn't known he was standing in. The next few hours had been ones of bliss, and not only as a result of the physical pleasure. What he felt was the culmination of a profound desire to fully express to Maureen just how much he loved and cherished her. There were times when his feelings for her were so powerful that they threatened to overwhelm him, times when he wanted to scream or punch a wall, to run through the streets grasping his hair by the roots and shouting her name, just because he didn't know what else to do with the passion burning within him. And so that day, when he'd been able to both possess her and to give himself over to her completely, felt like a gift, an answer to a question he hadn't been sure how to pose. In that moment, he truly understood why it was called making love. Since then, they hadn't been able to meet at her house again, but they had begun driving to the Arkwright Woods, where they would find a secluded spot and spend hours, naked together on a blanket, talking and kissing and making love. It wasn't about getting off, or scoring, as his friends liked to say. This was something that went beyond the physical. Rafi realized he was getting close to Eden, and thus Maureen, and so should probably start to devise a plan as to how he was going to get her to come out of the house, and talk to him without anyone else knowing. The houses in her lakefront neighborhood had large, fenceless backyards, and he decided he would hide somewhere behind her house and hope to see her through a window and then somehow signal to her. He arrived at her street but passed it, moving on to the one behind her house, so that he could enter her backyard without being seen, as he didn't want to arouse concern from the neighbors that he was a peeping Tom. Although, he guessed he sort of was, just not in a creepy, hope-to-see-someone naked kind of way. He found her yard and slipped in amongst the shadows cast by lit windows and street lamps, keeping himself hunkered low to the ground until he reached a garden shed, which would afford him a perfect view of the large picture window at the back of her house. The lights were on, and he could see her dining room and a slice of the living room beyond. He decided to go into the shed, where he would still be able to see the window, but would himself be hidden from view. He slipped inside and leaned against the wall next to the door and watched Maureen's house for any sign of movement from within. Raffi briefly toyed with the idea of just going up to the back door and knocking, in the hopes that Maureen would answer and could then find some excuse to come out and talk to him. But what if someone else answered? Too risky. He realized that it would also be a good idea to ask her to call his parents to come pick him up. For the night was growing ever colder, a rime of frost beginning to form on the grass in her yard. This was also going to make waiting difficult, as he had no idea how long it might be before he saw her and grabbed her attention. He then considered chucking pebbles at the window. If she appeared, great. If not, if someone else came to the window, then he would simply continue to hide himself within the shed, and whoever it was would no doubt think they were hearing things. He had just begun to run his hand over the cement floor of the shed, in the hopes of finding some small rocks, when he heard what sounded like a door opening. He looked out into the yard and saw that, indeed, someone had opened the back door, but it wasn't Maureen. Instead, he saw a tall, bulky man with a bald head and a closely trimmed beard come out, holding what appeared to be a plastic bag of garbage. He was walking into the yard and toward the street, and though Raffi could no longer see him, he heard a metal lid being removed and a clanking sort of thud as the man dropped the garbage into the trash can. Though Maureen had described him, this was the first time that Raffi had seen Maureen's husband, Robert. Suddenly, he felt exhausted. From his vantage point inside the shed, he could see Robert walking back toward the house, and was thinking maybe he should give up and just go home when the man started coming his way. Raffi's stomach dropped, and his heart began hammering. He learned then what was meant by the phrase, heart in one's throat. For a panicked second, he considered taking off, running out of the shed and past the man before he'd have time to react. But he didn't move, just stood frozen in place, his back pressed against the wall of the shed. "Who left this open?" he heard Robert mutter, and Raffi prepared himself for the inevitable confrontation. But the man didn't even glance into the shed, just reached in and pulled the door closed. A moment later, Raffi heard the back door to the house open and then close again. He slid down to the floor and allowed his heart to slow and his breathing to resume to normal. He felt utterly defeated. But before tears of frustration and sorrow and rage could overtake him, he got up, slowly opened the door of the shed, checked that the coast was clear, then took off running out of the yard and onto the sidewalk beyond. After about half of a block, he was forced to stop and retch into the gutter, as his gut poured forth the remains of his sugar dinner. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the bottom of his t-shirt, tears stinging his eyes. Cold and exhaustion crept into his every pore, and all he wanted now was to lie down and sleep, maybe forever. When he'd left his parents and the town of Dunkirk behind him on his way to Maureen, he had been certain that he would find a way to speak to her, that he would find solace in her arms. She was the only person he'd needed or wanted, so how could fate deny him this? But now he realized that there was so much more involved than just their love for each other, so that even when he truly and desperately needed her, she wasn't necessarily going to be there for him. Though he had known that she had a husband and kids, seeing Robert had made it real. And no matter how much she loved Raffi and repeatedly voiced her desire to be with him, she would always have to put them first. Each step felt as though he were wearing lead boots, and he was consumed with a bone-deep weariness. He was approaching a house with a large front porch, a waist-high wall wrapping around it on both sides, and across the front, with a gap where the steps came down. The house itself was dark, and there was no porch light on either. Raffi climbed the 4 steps and made his way to one of the front corners. He lay down and curled himself up tightly, making himself as small as possible, his head resting on his arm. And there he fell asleep, as a few snowflakes drifted down from the sky. It's summertime, and he is on his grandparents' farm in Ohio, Raffi's favorite place to be. He and his brother are playing catch on the grass in front of the old chicken coop, and they are children again. Raffi misses the ball, and it rolls into the coop, a dark and forbidding place, filled with colossal cobwebs that hang from the ceiling. They argue about who should have to retrieve the ball, eventually Rochambeauing, Raffi's scissors crushed by his brother's rock. Raffi stands in the doorway of the coop, hoping to locate the ball before he goes inside so as to spend as little time in there as possible. He sees it near the back wall, and ducking to avoid the cobwebs that try to grab at his hair and face, hurries into the coop, grabs the ball and runs back outside. He brushes his head with his hands several times, but even though he finds nothing, he can still feel the cobwebs on his skin. He expects to see his brother, but he is gone. Instead, he spots his grandfather lying in the hay wagon, his eyes closed, his body perfectly still. Raffi thinks he might be dead and runs to the wagon, calling out, "Grandpa! Grandpa, are you okay?" He reaches into the wagon and shakes his grandfather, who opens his eyes, looks at Raffi and says, "Time to wake up, boy." Raffi opened his eyes and saw the legs of a wicker chair. It took him a brief moment to remember where he was, and another moment to remember why. He sat up and realized he no longer felt cold, despite the fact that a layer of snow had coated the yards and streets while he slept. His head felt pleasantly fuzzy, much like after he'd taken cough syrup when he was sick. The neighborhood had become much darker than when he'd first arrived there, most of the houses dark, and he knew that it must be late. Slowly and stiffly he rose from the porch and made his way down the steps, his legs gangly and unsure of themselves, like a newborn colt's. He attempted a laugh at that thought, but his voice or his mouth didn't seem to be working, and all that came out was a strange, guttural, moaning sound. The snow crunched beneath his shoes as he walked aimlessly down the street, and despite his circumstances, he couldn't help but be moved by the beauty of the clean, unmarred snow that lay around him. Some part of his brain, intent on survival, demanded that he find a phone and call his parents to come get him. Although he didn't know for certain what hypothermia felt like, he had a feeling that he was well on the way toward getting it. Just up ahead, he could see a house with several of its windows still lit, and so he made his way to its porch, careful not to lose his footing on the steps. He knocked on the door, and shortly thereafter it opened, a friendly-looking, middle-aged man standing in its rectangle of light. The man appeared slightly startled at finding a teenage boy standing on his porch at that time of night, and Raffi gave him a sheepish wave. "Well, what are you doing out here in the cold so late?" the man asked, a note of genuine worry in his voice. Raffi shrugged and gestured at his throat while shaking his head, and then wrapped his arms around himself to indicate, he hoped, that he was apparently too cold to talk. "Let's get you inside and warmed up, and we'll worry about the rest in a bit," he said, as he stood back and waved Raffi into the house. "I'm going to get you some hot cocoa, son," he said, as he led Raffi into the kitchen and pulled a chair away from the table, gesturing for him to sit down. As he busied himself preparing the cocoa, he talked to Raffi over his shoulder. "It's a good thing you chose to come here, since I work at night. I'm an accountant, and for some reason I work best at night. I don't know why, Maybe because the rest of the world is asleep and quiet, and I can think better. My God, you're so cold you can't even talk, can you? Raffi smiled shyly and nodded. The man handed him a pen and a small notepad. It was difficult to make his fingers work, and his handwriting suffered as a result. Nevertheless, the man seemed able to read what he'd written, namely that he had had an argument with his parents and left, but that he would like the man to call them and tell them to come pick Raffi up. He had roughly scrawled his phone number at the bottom of the note. 366, that's Dunkirk. You walked all the way from Dunkirk? Raffi nodded. You should join the track team if you aren't on it already. Raffi laughed as the man walked over to the phone, dialed the number, and waited, smiling at Raffi. Someone on the other end answered because the man explained who he was and why he was calling, then gave directions to his house. The kettle whistled just after he'd hung up, and he went to the stove and turned it off, then poured the steaming water into the mug of cocoa powder. While he was doing this, Raffi had noticed a framed photo of a girl he recognized from school. As the man set the cocoa on the table, he noticed Raffi looking at the photo and said, "Oh, yeah, that's my daughter Missy. She's graduating this year." Raffi nodded and pointed at himself, and then at the photo. "Oh, you two in the same class?" he asked brightly, and Raffi gave him a nod. Raffi remembered Missy fairly well, actually. She had sat next to him in homeroom last year. A pretty girl, though shy and quiet. He had had a slight crush on her then, but once Maureen had come into his life, Raffi had forgotten all about Missy Wheelock. Thinking of Maureen caused his stomach to clench, and a feeling of despair washed over him. A short while later, his mum knocked on the door, and the man let her in. She thanked him, while apologizing at the same time, barely even looking Raffi's way. With his eyes, Raffi attempted to tell this extremely kind and helpful man just how much his efforts on his behalf had meant. The man smiled at him warmly and seemed to understand how Raffi felt. At least, Raffi hoped he did. In silence, he and his mum walked to the car, where his dad sat, behind the wheel, the engine idling. She opened the back door, and as Raffi climbed in, she squeezed his shoulder. His father stared straight ahead and said nothing as Raffi slid into the back seat, and his mom resettled herself in the front. For several minutes they drove, no sound except for the wind that occasionally slipped in around the windows. Raffi still felt numb, mentally as well as physically, the thoughts in his head swirling like the flakes of snow. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He remembered his dream and wondered about his grandpa. Is he still alive? He opened his eyes, thinking to ask, but realized that he somehow already knew that he wasn't. He looked toward his mum, whose head was tilted back and to the side against the seat, and remembered how red and swollen her eyes had been when she'd picked him up. He thought of what it must be like for her, to lose her dad, the man who had been a solid and constant presence in her life. Raffi's own relationship with his father was difficult at best, but he couldn't imagine him gone completely from his life. And then he thought of that morning, of the pride he'd felt in presenting his gift to his mom, the arrogance of his expectation that a clean house could take away her pain, even for a moment. It seemed such a ridiculous notion that he had a hard time reconciling the self he'd been several hours ago to who he was now. He had been selfish to expect her to praise him for helping out when she was probably barely keeping it together. Yet despite everything, when he'd needed them, they'd come out into the cold night to save him. In fact, he hadn't doubted for a sliver of a moment that they wouldn't. As far as they were concerned, it seemed to Raffi, there was no other choice. That trouble-causing cobweb came to mind, and he remembered from some nature show on PBS perhaps, that cobwebs were abandoned spiders' webs that had become too dusty, rendering them useless as a means of catching anything edible. Raffi thought of how a spider web began as something so intricate and delicate, a thing of beauty even, and ended up a useless wad of dirty strands that stuck and clung and hid, no longer something on which the spider could rely. And yet, it didn't just float away, it stayed. He guessed that was sort of like relationships. No matter how intricately and well-crafted it was, eventually life dirtied it, negative detritus latching on to each strand until it pulled it apart. Yet, even so, all those strands remained, sticking to you like cobwebs in an old chicken coop. It occurred to him that that was a pretty good allegory. He closed his eyes, smiling to himself. He couldn't wait to tell Maureen when he saw her after school on Monday. As his English teacher, she was sure to be impressed.
Thanks for listening to the Gnostic Connection on KLLG-LP Willits, California, Willits Hometown Radio. From my heart to yours, may we all be loving, happy, powerful, and free.